The House Majority Leader joins us from the Hill. Leader Hoyer, good to have you back. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
H.R. 1586, the Education, Jobs, and Medicaid Assistance Act. Any chance this is not going to happen?
No, it's going to pass. The Senate passed it, as you know, in a bipartisan way. We have come back from our break, the August break, in order to make sure that we pass it. We're particularly anxious about teachers being laid off. We think this is going to keep 160,000 teachers on the job, teaching our children and keeping class sizes from exploding, which will obviously be not helpful to teachers or students. So we think this bill is very important. We think it's going to pass. Obviously, the states are continuing to struggle. This bill is paid for. In part, it's paid for by closing down loopholes of shipping jobs overseas. We think that's appropriate, and we think that this bill will pass.
The president's going to give it a pep talk at 11:40 in the Rose Garden. He'll be joined on stage by some teachers, but that has not stopped the likes of Minority Leader McConnell from saying the states are simply becoming completely dependent on us. When does it end? Are these governors failing to make some tough choices of their own?
No, I think they're not. In fact, we've seen substantial layoffs at the state and local level, which is why the unemployment numbers remain very, very difficult to deal with. So we think that it's absolutely essential that we staunch the loss of jobs, police and fire and teachers, which we think are critical for the quality of life of our students and the safety of our people. So I think Senator McConnell is not right here. The states are experiencing the same economic challenge that the federal government is experiencing, and we need to help. We need to help, as I said, to keep those teachers on the job and to keep police and fire on the job, and we're paying for it. We're not adding to the deficit. We think that's critically important. We're paying for it, again, by, in part, closing loopholes for sending jobs overseas.
Senator Snowe has said this should be the final payment, that some hard choices are going to have to be made. Can we characterize it that way? Is this the last straw?
I don't know that this is the last straw, but Senator Snowe voted for this, of course, and she thought this was important to do. She's a Republican. Another Republican voted for it as well. We think they were right in this instance, but we're going to have to see what happens as we go forward. Clearly, you've been having a big discussion about what the Fed's going to do.
Yes.
They're concerned about the vibrancy of the economy. We're concerned about the vibrancy of the economy, and we need to keep a very close eye on making sure that we don't be penny wise and pound foolish. Let the economy go further into slowdown, because if we do that, obviously revenues fall, then you're chasing your tail. So I think that Senator McConnell is not accurate in his observations, and very, very frankly, I think the Republican leadership in the House misconstrues what the American public believe is appropriate to do in this instance. They don't want to see teachers laid off. They don't want to see class size explode, and they don't want to see police and fire laid off. They know that they're important for their community. So we think the American public understands and supports this effort. Again, I would emphasize, which is paid for.
Understood. As you know, the recovery, so to speak, is about a year old now. And as you point out, we continue to have discussions about what the Fed needs to do, whether jobless insurance needs to be extended yet again, the old 99-week discussion, this vote today. There is a point at which the federal government says no mas. Is that true or not?
Well, I think clearly the federal government, the Congress, the Democratic leadership, as well as the American public have said, look, we need to look at the deficits that we're incurring. I agree with that wholly. We need to make sure that we don't get to a level of debt and deficits which are dangerous.
But I guess
having said that, clearly, if you don't make sure your economy is moving, then inevitably your deficit and debt will explode as your revenues decrease. So it's a two-edged or two-step process here. We got to make sure the economy is moving, or we will never solve the debt and deficit problem.
Right. I guess my question is, at that point where you think additional stimulus is chasing bad money, how close are we to that point? It's clearly not today, because you think this bill is going to pass.
Well, but again, we're paying for this. We're not creating additional debt. We're not creating additional deficit. This bill is paid for. The border security bill that we're going to pass as well is also paid for. So this is not a question of adding to the deficit or putting ourselves deeper in a hole.
A Tea Partier would argue, yeah, it's paid for, but it's money that could be spent on something else, like lowering the deficit to begin with.
Well, yes, that would be accurate. But the problem with that is, as we said earlier, if you do that, if you frankly rob from Peter to pay Paul, your economy is going to continue to be sluggish, and you won't grow jobs, which we need to do. You won't grow revenues, which we need to do because of economic activity, not because of increased taxes, but increased economic activity. So that we need to pursue that objective as we keep our eye on the ball as well of debts and deficits.
Leader Hoyer, I hear what you're saying. No one wants to see teachers out of work. I guess my question is, how much of our education system is built up at this point on false profits that came in from the housing boom? We saw housing prices increase every single year for more than a decade. As a result, we saw property taxes go up every single year for more than a decade. That money goes straight back into the education system. Is there a disconnect between once revenue does increase again and come back from a better economy and where you're going to be in terms of housing prices, which aren't expected to come back into some sort of a fix for the next decade?
Well, clearly, states' revenues in my own state and states around the country, many states are participating not just on property tax, but on income tax revenues as well. And to the extent that those revenues increase, states will be better able to maintain the services that the public expects, particularly in education and police and fire. Nobody believes those are expenses which are optional. A child is in the first grade usually just once, and you need to make sure that that child gets the services they need that year so they can move on, progress, and very frankly become productive members of our society, which helps the economy. Everybody believes that investment in education is critical if we're going to grow the economy and compete in the global marketplace. So my view is that in the short term, we need to make sure that we don't lay off teachers. We're not laying off police and fire. But in the long term, clearly states have to rely on their own resources and manage their education and their police and fire so that they can afford it. But nobody doubts that we're in a very tough economic time for states, municipalities, cities, as well as the national government. And we need to pull ourselves out of this, and letting 160,000 or plus or minus teachers be laid off as we begin the school year in September does not seem to be, and I don't think is, a wise move for us to take, which is why we've come back to Washington after the Senate finally passed something, by the way, that we had passed last December.
Yeah, that's sort of the running theme, stuff that you guys got done way in advance.
Yes.
The Senate finally came around on. We'll be watching this afternoon, Leader Hoyer. Thank you for your time.
You bet. Thanks a lot.
Steny Hoyer of Maryland. When we come back, a lot more of our all-star lineup at 8.